Okay, we've got Into the Unknown, Chapter 1, Section 5. When Henson and his companions, after their perilous adventures in the ice, landed with flags flying on their boats on the east waste of Greenland, the first thing they did was to give vent to their feelings in a ringing hurrah, a sound which those wild and barren crags had never re-echoed before. Their joy indeed on feeling firm ground beneath their feet once more baffles description. In a word, they conducted themselves like a pack of schoolboys, singing, laughing, and playing all manner of pranks. The Lapps, however, did not partake in the general merriment, but took themselves off up the mountainside, where they remained several hours. But when their first ebullition of joy had somewhat subsided, Henson himself followed the example of the Lapps and clambered up the slope in order to get a good view over the landscape, leaving the others to prepare the banquet they had determined to indulge in that evening on the beach. And here he remained some little while, entranced with the wondrous beauty of the scene. The sea and the ice stretched far away to the east, shining like a belt of silver beneath him, while on the west the mountain tops were bathed in a flood of hazy sunshine, and the inland ice, the Sahara of the north, extended in a level, unbroken plain for miles and miles into the interior. A snow bunting perched on a stone close by him and chirped a welcome. To the south, the grand outline of the Cape Tordenskjold rose up in the horizon. In rejoining his comrades, the feast was ready. It consisted of oatmeal biscuits, Geary cheese, whortleberry jam, and chocolate. For this one day at least, they would enjoy themselves to the full. On the morrow, their daily fare would be to eat little, sleep little, and work as hard as possible. Today, then, should be the first and the last of such indulgence. Time was precious. On the next day, therefore, they resumed their northward journey along the east coast, fighting their way day and night, inch by inch, foot by foot through the drift ice, at times in peril, at others in safety, ever forward in one incessant, monotonous struggle. And now they approached the ill-omened Puisortok, of which Eskimo and European seafarers had many an evil tale to tell. There, it was said, masses of ice would either shoot up suddenly from beneath the surface of the water and crush any vessel that ventured near, or would fall down from the overhanging height and overwhelm it. There, not a word must be spoken. There must be no laughing, no eating, no smoking, if one would pass it in safety. Above all, the fatal name of Puisortok must not pass the lips, else the glacier would be angry and certain destruction ensue. Henson, however, it may be said, did not observe these regulations, and yet managed to pass it in safety. In his opinion, there was nothing very remarkable or terrible about it. But something else took place at Puisortok that surprised him and his companions. On July 30th, as they were preparing their midday meal, Henson heard, among the shrill cries of the seabirds, a strange, weird sound. What it could be, he could not conceive. It resembled the cry of a loon more than anything else, and kept coming nearer and nearer. Through the telescope, however, he discerned two dark specks among the ice floes, now close together, now a little apart, making straight for them. They were human beings, evidently, human beings in the midst of that desert region of ice, which they had thought to be a barren, uninhabited waste. Balto, too, watched their approach attentively, with half astonished, half uneasy look, for he believed them to be supernatural beings. On came the strangers, one of them bending forward in his kayak as if bowing in salutation, And on coming alongside the rock, they crawled out of their kayaks and stood before Nansen and his companions with bare heads, dressed in jackets and trousers of sealskin, smiling and making all manner of friendly gestures. They were Eskimo and had glass beads in their jet black hair. Their skin was of a chestnut hue, and their movements, if not altogether graceful, were attractive. On coming up to our travelers, they began to ask questions in a strange language, which, needless to say, was perfectly unintelligible. Nansen indeed tried to talk to them in Eskimo from a conversation book, that tongue he had with him, but it was perfectly useless. And it was not till both parties had recourse to the language of signs that Nansen was able to ascertain that they belonged to an Eskimo encampment to the north of Pasortok. These two Eskimo were good-natured little beings, and now they began to examine the equipment of the travelers and to taste their food, for which they seemed beyond measure pleased, expressing their admiration at all they saw by a long-drawn kind of bovine bellow. Finally, they took leave and set off northward in their kayaks, which they managed with wonderful dexterity, and soon disappeared from sight. At 6 the same evening, our travelers followed in the same direction, and in a short time reached the Eskimo encampment at Cape Bile. Long, however, before their eyes could detect any signs of tents or human beings, their sense of smell became aware of a rank odor of train oil, accompanied by a sound of voices, and they presently saw numbers of Eskimo standing on the sea beach and on the rocks, earnestly watching the approach of the strangers. It was a picturesque sight that presented itself to the eyes of our travelers. All about the ledges of the rocks, writes Nansen, stood long rows of strangely wild, shaggy-looking creatures, men, women, and children, all dressed in much the same scanty attire, wearing and pointing at us and uttering the same cow-like sound we had heard in the forenoon. They were all smiling. A smile indeed is the only welcoming salute of the Eskimo, all eager to help Nansen and his companions ashore, chattering away incessantly in their own tongue like a saucepan boiling and bubbling over with their words, not one of which, alas, could Nansen or his companions understand. Presently, Nansen was invited to enter one of their tents, in which was an odor of such remarkable nature, such a blending of several ingredients, that a description thereof is impossible. It was the smell, as it were, of a mixture of train oil, human exhalations, and the effluvium of fetid liquids, all intimately mixed up together. While men and women lying on the floor around the fire, children rolling about everywhere, dogs sniffing all around, helped to make up a scene that was decidedly unique. All of the occupants were of a brownish-grayish hue, due mostly to the non-application of soap and water, and were swarming with vermin. All of them were shiny with train oil, plump, laughing, chattering creatures, in a word, presenting a picture of primitive social life, in all its original blessedness. The hospitality of these children of nature was boundless. They would give away all they possessed, even the shirt on their backs, had they possessed such an article, and certainly showed extreme gratitude when their liberality was reciprocated, evidently placing a high value on empty biscuit tins, for each time one of them got one presented to him, he would at once bellow forth his joy at the gift. But what especially seemed to attract their interest was when Nansen and his companions began to undress, for turning in for the night into their sleeping bags, while to watch them creep out of the same next morning afforded them no less interest. They were entertained, however, a great dread of the camera, for every time Nansen turned his dark glass eye upon them, a regular stampede would take place. The next day, Nansen and the Eskimo parted company, some of the later proceeding on their way to the south, others accompanying him on his journey northward. The journey northward was an extremely fatiguing one, for they encountered such stormy weather that their boats were more than once narrowly escaped being nipped in the ice. As a set-off, however, to this, the scenery proved to be magnificent. The floating mountains of ice resembling enchanting castles, and all nature was on a stupendous scale. Finally, they reached the harbor on Griffin Phelps Island, where they enjoyed the first hot meal they had on their coasting expedition, consisting of caraway soup. This meal of soup was a great comfort to the weary and worn-out travelers. Here is striking but silent testimony of that severe and pitiless climate presented itself in the form of a number of skulls and human bones lying blanched and scattered among the rocks, evidently the remains of Eskimo who in times long gone had perished from starvation. After an incredible amount of toil, Nansen arrived at a small island in the entrance of Enugsamund Fjord, and he thence proceeded to Skoldungen, where the water was more open. Here they encamped and were almost eaten up by mosquitoes. You're kidding me. There's even mosquitoes up there in the barren Iceland. Let's see. Are we at the halfway point of section 5? I think I'll go a few pages more. On August 6th, they again set out on their way northward, meeting with another encampment of Eskimo, who were, however, so terrified at the approach of the strangers that they one and all bolted off to the mountain, and it was not till Nansen presented them with an empty tin box and some needles that they became reassured, after which they accompanied the expedition for some little distance, and on parting gave Nansen a quantity of dried seal's flesh. The farther our travelers proceeded on their journey, the more dissatisfied and uneasy did Balta and Ravna become. Accordingly, one day Nansen took the opportunity of giving Balto a good scolding, who with tears and sobs gave vent to his complaints. They had had not enough food, coffee only 3 times during the whole journey, and they had to work harder than any beast the whole livelong day, and he would gladly give many thousands of kroner to be safe at home once more. There was indeed something in what Balto said. The fare had unquestionably been somewhat scanty, and the work severe, and it was evident that these children of nature, hardy though they were, could not vie with civilized people when it became a question of endurance for any length of time, and risking life and taxing one's ability to the utmost. Finally, on August 10th, the expedition reached Umivik in a dense fog. After a very difficult journey through the ice, they encamped for the last time on the east coast of Greenland. Here they boiled coffee, shot a kind of snipe, and lived like gentlemen, so that even Balta and Ravna were quite satisfied. The next day, August 11th, rose gloriously bright. Far away among the distant glaciers, a rumbling sound like a cannon could be heard, while snow-covered mountains towered high overhead, on the other side of which lay boundless tracts of endless ice. Nansen and Sverdrup now made a reconnoitering expedition, and did not return till 5 o'clock the next morning. It still required some days to overhaul and get everything in complete order for their journey inland, and it was not till 9 o'clock in the evening of August 16th, after first dragging up on land the boats, in which a few necessary articles of food were stored, together with a brief account of progress of the expedition carefully packed in a tin box, that they commenced their journey across the inland ice. Nansen and Sverdrup led the way with the large sleigh, while the others, each dragging a smaller one, followed in their wake. Thus, these 6 men, confident of solving the problem before them, with the firm earth beneath their feet, commenced the ascent of the mountain slope, which Nansen christened Nordenskjold's Nunatak. Their work had now begun in real earnest, a work so severe and arduous that it would require all the strength and powers of endurance they possessed to accomplish it. The ice was full of fissures, and these had either to be circumvented or crossed, a very difficult matter with heavily laden sleighs. A covering of ice often lay over these fissures, so that great caution was required. Hence, their progress was often very slow, each man being roped to his fellow, so that if one of them should happen to disappear into one of these fathomless abysses, his companion could haul him up. Such an occurrence happened more than once, for Nansen, as well as the others, would every now and then fall plump up into the arms, dangling with his legs over empty space. But it always turned out well, for powerful hands took hold of the rope, and the practiced gymnasts knew how to extricate themselves. Okay, we're going to stop here in this first half of section 5 on page 25.